In the multipolar world that we live in today, there are three great powers: the United States, China, and Russia. And the United States is still the most powerful state on the planet. But not too far behind the United States is China, which appears to be catching up quickly. And then a distant third is Russia. It's very important to understand that Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. From an American perspective, China is a peer competitor. Russia is not a peer competitor. It's a weak, great power. But those are the three great powers in the system. That today, what you have in this multipolar world are two conflict dyads. One is the U.S.-China dyad. The other is the U.S.-Russia dyad. And I would contrast this with the Cold War, where you had only one dyad, which was the U.S.-Soviet dyad. And you understand that in unipolarity, because there was only one great power, there was no great power politics. You can't have great power politics when there's only one great power. Finally, I would note to you that I think the two conflict dyads that exist today are more dangerous than the conflict dyad that existed in the Cold War. The two conflict dyads that exist today are more dangerous than the conflict dyad that existed in the Cold War. How do I want to proceed? I want to proceed by talking about four different topics. First, I want to give you my theory of international politics, my theory of great power politics. I want to tell you how I think the world works at its most basic level. That's number one. Then I want to talk about the U.S.-China competition. And I want to take my discussion of the U.S.-China competition and link it to my theory. Then I want to shift gears, and I want to talk about the U.S.-Russia competition. I want to compare the U.S.-Russia competition to the U.S.-China competition and link it back to my theory. So let me start with my theory of international politics. As some of you know, I have a very simple theory of international politics. I start with 5 assumptions about the world. And then I take those 5 assumptions and I mix them up and I come up with a series of behaviors involving the great powers. So let me tell you what the 5 assumptions are. My first assumption about the world is that states are the principal actors, countries are the principal actors, and there's no higher authority that sits above states. As many of you know, in international relations speak, we refer to this as anarchy. The world is anarchic. Anarchic does not mean murder and mayhem. Anarchic is an organizing principle. The system is anarchic. There's no higher authority. Point 2, or assumption 2, is that all states have some offensive military capability. Now, obviously, some states have more offensive military capability than others do. The United States, for example, has much more offensive capability than Hungary. But Hungary does have some offensive military capability. So the second assumption has to do with capabilities. The third assumption has to do with intentions. Right? When I was an Air Force officer, I was in technical intelligence. And when we looked at the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, we always want to know, what do their capabilities look like? And what are their intentions? What are Soviet intentions and what do their capabilities look like? Okay? So the second assumption deals with capabilities. That's the offensive capabilities argument. The third assumption deals with intentions. And the intentions argument goes like this. No state can ever be certain as to what what the intentions of other states are. You just can't know for sure what the intentions of other states are. Now, why is this a case? If you think about capabilities, offensive capabilities, you can see them and you can measure them. During the Cold War, we could count how many armored division equivalents the Warsaw Pact had. We could count how many SS-18 missiles the Soviet Union had. We could count how many submarines they had, because they were material things that you could see. Intentions are remarkably difficult to figure out because they're in people's heads, and you can't see into people's heads. So we could never figure out exactly what Soviet intentions were, whether Stalin was running Soviet policy, Khrushchev was running policy, or Brezhnev. It's just very hard to get inside those leaders' heads and figure out what their intentions were. Now, if you think that's not true, and intentions are reasonably easy to figure out, not impossible, but reasonably easy, my counter-argument to that is you cannot know future intentions. None of you know who will be running Russia in 20 years. None of you know who will be running Germany or the United States in 20 years. So you can't know Russia's, America's, or Germany's intentions. So one of the fundamental assumptions underpinning my theory is uncertainty about intentions. This is not to say you can be certain that another state will have bad intentions. You just can't be certain that it won't have bad intentions. So I've told you so far that there are three assumptions. One is states are the key actors. The system is anarchic. There's no higher authority that sits above states, one. Two, all states have some offensive military capability. And three, you just can't be certain about the intentions of other states. Now, I have two other assumptions that I'm going to throw out. The fourth assumption is that the principal goal of states is survival. And the reason is simple. If you don't survive, you can't pursue any of your other goals. So survival has to be the number one goal for every state in the system. And then the fifth assumption is that states are rational actors. They're basically strategic calculators. They're good at coming up with strategies for maximizing their prospects of survival. So the fourth assumption is survival, and the fifth assumption is states are rational actors. So those are 5 assumptions. I think they're all reasonable assumptions. You take them, you put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, you mix them up, and you get a very, very competitive and dangerous world. Now, why is that the case? First, states fear each other. Why do they fear each other? They fear each other because there may be a powerful state that has malign intentions, right? If you're France after World War I, and you know you're living next door to Germany, and you can't know what Germany's intentions are going to be 10, 15, 20 years in the future, and you know that the Germans have a huge amount of latent capability, you're going to fear them. And the French did fear them, right? So you fear them for that reason. The second reason that states fear each other is if you get into trouble, you're in an anarchic system, which means there's no higher authority that you can call, right? So fear is a constant among great powers in the international system. The second form of behavior you get is self-help. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. That's the way international politics works. You do not depend on anybody else. This is not to say you can't form alliances, but it is to say it's a self-help world. States fear each other, and they They understand that they have to take care of themselves. The third form of behavior is that you figure out very quickly that the best way to survive in the international system is to be the most powerful state in the system. It's to maximize your relative power. In a world, an anarchic world, where you cannot know the intentions of other states, and other states may be really powerful, the best way to survive is to be the most powerful state in the system. When I talk about maximizing power, the ideal situation is to be a regional hegemon, to dominate your region of the world, number one, and number two, to make sure that no other state dominates its region of the world. Everybody follow that? So just take the United States. When I talk about maximizing power, the ideal situation is to be a regional hegemon, to dominate your region of the world, number one, and number two, to make sure that no other state dominates its region of the world. Everybody follow that? So just take the United States. The United States, when it got started in 1783, was comprised of 13 colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. What we did was we marched across the continent and we carved out this huge and powerful state. And then with the Monroe Doctrine, we pushed the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere, and we told them, you are not welcome back here. This is our hemisphere, and you stay out. We went to great lengths to create regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, we do not tolerate peer competitors. We played a key role in putting Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union all on the scrap heap of history. And you can see the United States putting its crosshairs on China today. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. We do not want any other country on the planet to ever imitate us. According to our playbook, there's only one country that's allowed to be a regional hegemon, and that's the United States of America. One country that's allowed to be a regional hegemon, and that's the United States of America. This is completely consistent with the theory that I laid out to you. I gave you the logic that underpins it. Now, I just want to say a word or two more. I've emphasized the importance of gaining power, becoming a regional hegemon, maximizing your power. It's also very important to understand that states that are facing a great power that's getting more and more powerful go to great lengths to balance against that state. So states in the international system, here we're talking mainly about great powers, balance against rising states. They try to check states that are encroaching on them. That's the balancing behavior that comes out of my story. But again, the ideal situation is to be a regional hegemon. Now, that's my theory. Let's talk about the U.S.-China competition. What's going on here is very simple. As a result of America's policy of engagement with China, which started in the early 1990s, we have foolishly helped turn China into an economically powerful country. China has grown very wealthy, and as you all know, it has a huge population. Population and wealth are the two foundations of military power. Because China has so many people and it's now so wealthy, it's not just a peer competitor to the United States, it's also a potential regional hegemon. And you know what the Chinese are doing? The Chinese are interested in becoming a regional hegemon. They want to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And I want to be very clear here. I do not blame the Chinese 1 second. If I was in Beijing and I was running Chinese foreign policy, my aim would be to make sure that China is by far the most powerful country in Asia, and I would go to great lengths to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain and then beyond the second island chain. I'd have my own Chinese Monroe Doctrine, and I'd want to make sure the Americans are across the Pacific Ocean. Just like we want to make sure, from an American point of view, the Chinese are across the Pacific Ocean. The Chinese understand full well what happens when you're weak in the international system. They call it the century of national humiliation. It lasted from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. As most of you know, I'm sure, China was very weak during that 100-year period. And you know what happened to them when they were very weak? The other great powers in the system, including the United States of America, preyed upon them. They were victimized at every turn. The Chinese understand full well, if you want to survive in the international system, you want to be really powerful. Indeed, you want to imitate the United States. You want to dominate Asia the way the Americans dominate the Western Hemisphere. This is what my theory tells you. It's what the Americans did, and it's what the Chinese are doing. They want to dominate Asia. If the Chinese want to get Taiwan back, they want to control the South China Sea, they want to control the East China Sea, they want those rocks back in the East China Sea. There's one simple way to do it. Get the Americans out of East Asia and make sure they are the most powerful state in the system. So that's what they're doing. What about the Americans? I told you about the Americans before. The Americans do not tolerate peer competitors. We're not going to let China dominate Asia unless we absolutely have to. Unless China just grows so powerful, there's nothing we can do to stop it from dominating Asia. And you understand there's a military dimension and an economic dimension to our policy. We're putting together a balancing coalition in East Asia, mainly based around military forces to contain China. We're talking about how to defend Taiwan militarily. That's the military part of the balancing coalition. There's an economic dimension to our strategy. We're actually trying to roll back Chinese economic growth. We want to strangle Chinese economic growth because we understand full well that military power is largely a function of economic power. So the United States, right, the United States is not simply containing China. We're talking about a rollback strategy. The United States, as many of you know, and probably many of you don't know, is a ruthless great power. You never want to underestimate how ruthless the United States is. Despite all the liberal rhetoric that we use to cover up our ruthless behavior, we are tough customers. And the Chinese are finding that out now. In the early 1990s, when I told the Chinese, if you continue to grow economically, there's going to be a fierce security competition, and you're going to be shocked at how ruthless the United States is. They simply didn't believe me, because the United States was treating them very well at the time. I said, what you don't understand is that the structure is going to change. And when the structure changes, when we go from unipolarity to multipolarity, and you're a peer competitor, we're going to think about you very differently than we think about you now. And that's exactly what's happening. So you see what's happened here is you have this intense security competition between the United States, which doesn't tolerate peer competitors on one hand, and China on the other hand, which is interested in becoming a regional hegemon, a peer of the United States, a full peer. Why is it so dangerous? I'm not going to go into this at any length, but Taiwan is the key here. Taiwan is a very dangerous situation. The United States feels that it has to defend Taiwan for security reasons. So you see the United States moving closer and closer to Taiwan. It's very important to understand that Taiwan is sacred territory for China. The Chinese are deeply committed to making sure that Taiwan does not remain independent over the long term and that it's incorporated back into the mainland. And we're basically saying, we meaning the Americans are basically saying, that's not happening, right? And we're tightening our relationship with Taiwan which means de facto independence for the foreseeable future. And this, not surprisingly, enrages the Chinese. So this is a very dangerous conflict dyad. We go to the third part of my talk and focus on U.S.-Russian relations, which revolve these days mainly around the Ukraine war. Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is certainly true in the United States, certainly true in places like Poland, the Baltic states, and most of Western Europe. The conventional wisdom is that the Russians are bent on establishing hegemony in Europe. The argument is that the Russians, especially Vladimir Putin, are an imperial power, and that Vladimir Putin wants to either recreate the Soviet Union or he wants to create a greater Russia. And then, once that's done, he's going to push forward to create an empire in Eastern Europe. And the argument, as you know, is that he is determined, number one, to conquer Ukraine, number two, occupy Ukraine, and number three, make it part of a greater Russia. And then, when he's done with Ukraine, he'll march on toward other states, like Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, who knows? He's an imperialist. He's bent on regional hegemony, in effect. Right? This is the argument. And if you believe this story, it looks a lot like the China story, right? China, as I told you, there's no question that what China is trying to do is establish regional hegemony. The question is, do you think that's what the Russians are doing? I do not think that is true. I think it is dead wrong. First of all, it's very clear to me that there is no evidence, none, that Putin has ever said that he thought it would be a good idea to conquer Ukraine and make it part of Russia. There's no evidence that he ever said he thought it was feasible to do that. And there's no evidence that he ever said that that's what he plans to do. Nobody can show me where he said any one of those three things. Furthermore, Russia does not have the capability to conquer Ukraine, much less conquer other countries. And oh, by the way, there's no evidence he ever talked about conquering any other country. That's not surprising. If he didn't talk about conquering and integrating Ukraine into a greater Russia, he surely wasn't going to talk about doing that with the Baltic states or Poland. He never talked about that. There's no evidence of that. But again, he doesn't have the capability. You all have noticed that the Russians can barely defeat the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. How are these Russian forces going to conquer all of Ukraine? Have you ever looked at the number of troops that the Russians sent into Ukraine on February 24th? At the most, 190,000, at the most. You know, when the Germans went into Poland, September 1st, 1939, the Germans went in with 1.5 million troops. And by the way, in the middle of September, the Soviets came in the back door. The Germans, as a result of the von Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, understood full well that they wouldn't be conquering Poland alone. They'd be doing it with the Red Army. And Poland was not a formidable military state at the time. They still went in with 1.5 million troops. Putin went in with 190,000 troops at the most, and he didn't really have any reserves that could have been brought in afterwards. You're not going to conquer Ukraine with a force that size. Ukraine is a huge piece of territory, as you all surely understand. He wasn't interested in conquering Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. What was he doing? It's quite clear what he was doing. He was defending Russia against the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. He wasn't interested in conquering Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. He was defending Russia against the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. We had a policy in the West, driven mainly by the United States, that had three prongs to it. One was NATO expansion. The goal was to bring Ukraine into NATO. The second prong was to bring Ukraine into the European Union. And the third prong was to foster an orange revolution in Ukraine and make it a pro-Western liberal democracy. These are the three prongs of the strategy. And the overall goal was, again, to create a Ukraine that was a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Now, NATO expansion was really the key. That's what really spooked the Russians. Of the three elements of the strategy, it was NATO expansion. It was, as many of you know, in April of 2008, at the Bucharest NATO summit, where NATO announced, when the summit ended, that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. Putin, who was actually at the summit, he was on friendly terms with the West at that point in time, went ballistic. The Russians made it unequivocally clear that Ukraine in NATO was categorically unacceptable. William Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, was then, 2008, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. He wrote a memorandum to Condoleezza Rice, who was then Secretary of State, warning against NATO expansion into Ukraine. He said that Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines for all members of the Russian foreign policy establishment, not just Putin. Angela Merkel, who much to her credit opposed making any kind of offer to Ukraine in the April 2008 summit, said recently that the reason she opposed that idea was she understood it was the equivalent of a, these are her words, declaration of war against Russia. This is what Angela Merkel said. Nevertheless, the United States continued to push forward. We had gotten NATO expansion through for the first time in 1999. You all know this is when Hungary became a member of NATO, 1999. Then in 2004, we had the second expansion of NATO. Countries like Romania, the Baltic states, Slovenia came in to the alliance, right? And here we are, 2008. This is going to be the third big tranche. We're going to bring in Georgia, and we're going to bring in Ukraine. You remember what happened with Georgia. 4 months later, in August 2008, you had a war over Georgia. Surprise of surprises. The Russians were putting their foot down. Nevertheless, we continued to push. We continued to push. Why did we continue to push? The answer is Russia was weak. Think of the century of national humiliation for the Chinese. The Americans thought they could shove another tranche of expansion to include Ukraine down Russia's throat. We thought the Russians were weak. And you know, when you're weak and the Americans got their gun sights on you, they're not good, right? So we continued to push, even after things blew up in Georgia in August 2008. And what was the end result? The end result is that in February 22nd, 2014, to be exact, the crisis in Ukraine broke out. And this is when The Russians took the Crimea, and trouble started in the Donbass, and you effectively got a civil war in the Donbass that the Russians were involved in. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what did the Americans do in response? You might have thought that the Americans would have backed off, seeing the trouble that they had stirred up. But the Americans did not back off. NATO did not back off. In fact, we doubled down. We then started training large numbers of Ukrainian forces. We then started arming large numbers of Ukrainian forces. We were giving them intelligence, and we were helping them plan their military operations in the Donbass, in the civil war that was taking place in the Donbass. In effect, what was happening is that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. This is why in December 2021, Putin and Lavrov made it very clear. They wrote a letter to the head of NATO, and they wrote a letter to President Biden saying, we want a written statement that says Ukraine will never become part of NATO. They had a number of other demands as well. The reason that happened was that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. And the American response was, we're not changing anything. Nothing is going to change. And the end result is, on February 24th, Putin launched what was effectively a preventive war. Putin has decided that there are two possible outcomes here. One is a neutral Ukraine, which is what they preferred all along, or a Ukraine that is wrecked and is a rump state. And as you all know, what the Russians are now doing is they're wrecking Ukraine. This is a total disaster. It's absolutely horrible. I do not want to make light of it for 1 second. But the point is, it's just hard to understand. We should understand it from our own historical experience. All sorts of people said, this is going to lead to no end of trouble. Not only is it going to lead to no end of trouble, when the trouble comes, we're going to blame the Russians. And of course, that's exactly what happens, because we in the United States are never responsible for any of the world's problems. It's always somebody else. We are deeply committed. I'm talking more about the Americans than the Europeans, but even NATO, to the point where if the Russians succeed, then the temptation for us, the West, especially the United States, to enter the war will be very great. Biden will be under tremendous pressure to go in and help rescue the Ukrainians. So you can see the potential for escalation. And you all know that Avril Haines, the woman who is the director of national intelligence in the United States, right? She says that the most likely scenario for the Russians to use nuclear weapons would be if the Americans or NATO comes into the fight, because the Russians are not going to be able to stand up to us. Right? You all know, as I said before, the Russians can barely handle the Ukrainians in the Donbass. Right? The Russian military is no match for the United States, no match for NATO. And what Avril Haines was saying is that's the circumstance under which the Russians will be desperate. And you all understand the Russians believe they're facing an existential threat. It's very important that you understand this. They believe that they're facing an existential threat. They thought Ukraine and NATO was an existential threat. Well, now we're talking about a situation where you're not only being threatened by Ukraine becoming part of NATO, becoming a member of NATO, you're also threatened by the fact that the United States is talking about defeating you on your doorstep. And if the American military is to come into the fight, and the American military is fighting on Ukrainian territory right next door to Russia, this is an existential threat. This is where states use nuclear weapons.
Do you foresee a scenario in the world where the West and the East will be completely separated economically, technologically? There will be very, very limited trade, like as during the Cold War era.
Tell me what you mean by the West and the East. I mean,
The West mostly driven by the US and the East led by China. I had a previous question to that, but partly maybe your presentation answered that. That was, if the US considers China as a peer competitor, wouldn't it make sense for the US to have a strong ally in form of Europe, and not like weaken them against the Russia conflict when China is the real peer competitor?
Good. I should have understood your question to begin with. Let me start by saying that if you're the United States of America and you're in a multipolar world, and China is a peer competitor and a potential regional hegemon, and Russia is a weak great power, it's in your interest to have Russia as an ally, okay? And what the United States should be doing is it should be minimizing the forces that it has in Europe and forming an alliance with Russia so that Russia is part of the balancing coalition against China. That's what we should have done. But instead, what has happened is we have picked a fight with the Russians. The Russians are now a mortal enemy, and we have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and we have gotten more deeply involved militarily in Europe than was the case during the unipolar moment. This is at a time when we should be pivoting to Asia. You know all the emphasis the Americans put on pivoting to Asia? It's very hard to pivot to Asia when you're increasing your commitment in Europe. So we're increasing our commitment in Europe, and we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This gets to your question. I think that what's happening here is we are, for the foreseeable future, moving to a world where you have the Russians and the Chinese on one side, the Iranians and the North Koreans as others, and others as well, right? And then on the other side, you have the Americans, the West Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Australians, the so-called West. So I think you are getting, I wouldn't have thought to call it an East-West divide, but that's a good term. You are getting something of an East-West divide here. And remember what we were talking about with regarding to economic intercourse in Europe. It looks like Russian-European economic intercourse is going to dry up in large part in the years ahead. It's already happening, which would just reinforce the point that I'm making. So I think, yeah, this is what's happening. And I think from an American point of view, it's not in our interest because, again, it would be in our interest to have an alliance with the Russians. By the way, just look at the Iranians. The Americans have this thing about Iran where we constantly, right, talk about how evil the Iranians are. We're unwilling to, reach any form of meaningful agreement with them and so forth and so on. And what we've in effect done with the Iranians is driven them into the arms of the Russians. The Russians are getting all sorts of drones and ballistic missiles from the Iranians that are invaluable in their war in Ukraine. And that's because the Iranians have a vested interest in working with the Russians because the Americans have their gun sights on Iran. I don't think that's smart either.
I'd like to ask a question regarding the Visegrad cooperation, that is Czechia, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. You highlighted the importance of economics and population. Together, these four countries are the third largest in the European Union, with 68 million people, with the fifth largest economy in the European Union, and on the world stage with the 12th largest economy. So in our place, what is your playbook to us so that we can become the regional hegemon of Europe as the Visegrad Group? Köszönöm. Thank you.
Well, the problem that argument faces is that we live in a world where the most powerful political ideology is nationalism. And that means that we live in a world that's populated by nation states that care greatly about their sovereignty. And they're willing to form institutions, and they're willing to follow the rules that those institutions come up with. But they are not willing to surrender their sovereignty. This should be music to the ears of the audience. But just think about Brexit. Brexit tells you that the British, even though they joined the European Union, remained a sovereign state because they had the ability, they had the authority, right, to pull out of the European Union if they thought that was the right thing to do. Hungary could pull out of the European Union. What this tells you is that clusters of states can form institutions, but they can't create a new nation state. Just think about Europe. People will often say to me, you know, you got the United States here, Europe there, and Russia here. I say, what's Europe? Europe's not a state. It's a collection of states. I want to know, what do the Germans think, what do the French think, and so forth and so on. Europe's not a state, right? So you can take a bunch of relatively small countries in Central Europe, and you can form a military alliance, or you could form, you know, an economic institution that was very powerful as well, a mini EU, a mini NATO, what have you. But you still would not be creating a state. And a hegemon is a state. States are what matter in international politics. Again, nationalism. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And the concept of a nation state is the embodiment of nationalism, right? So the fact of the matter is that for the foreseeable future, I believe almost forever, right, Europe is going to be comprised of a series of states. The cast of characters may change over time, but it's going to be dominated by states. And Europe, as a single entity, is never going to happen. And by the way, you know my theory, because I've laid it out for you now. My theory says that if Europe, the EU, were to become a nation state, it would be a regional hegemon, right? It would be a regional hegemon. The United States would go to enormous lengths to wreck that nation state. You understand, the United States has talked about this. The United States does not want a united Europe, a Europe that is a powerful single state, because it would be a threat to us.
I wanted to ask you about the option of nuclear escalation again, in terms of the scenario where we presume that American boots are on Ukrainian soil. So you argued that as that option would be seen by Russia as an existential threat, it's a potential for the usage of nuclear weapons, but I would presume that in a Russian nuclear strike in which there are American casualties, that scenario would warrant a similar response. So is it wrong to presume that maybe mutually assured destruction is a strong enough force to prevent the usage of nuclear weapons even in such a radical situation? Like, say, as long as Russia's territorial integrity is not directly threatened.
Yeah, another great question. Let me just say a few words about nuclear use, the different scenarios. The most likely scenario at this point in time where Russia uses nuclear weapons would be in Ukraine. If Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, it would be tempted, at least, powerfully tempted, to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine against Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian targets. So in that case, the United States would not be involved, NATO would not be involved, and we would therefore not have to retaliate. This is one of the reasons that I'm very nervous that the Russians may use nuclear weapons if they're losing in Ukraine. Because if they're losing in Ukraine, they can use nuclear weapons inside Ukraine with a low risk that the Americans will hit them with nuclear weapons. Okay? So that's one possibility. Now, the other possibility is that if the Russians, if the Americans get involved in the war, that NATO gets involved in the war, the Russians are likely to use nuclear weapons. Your question is the threat of mutual assured destruction, which is certainly there. You're absolutely right. It's sitting in the background. Both sides have the ability to turn the other side into a smoking, radiating ruin. Okay, that's mad. Mutual assured destruction. Does that mean, this is his question, does that mean the Russians won't use nukes because they don't want to get incinerated? Of course, they don't want to get incinerated, but the way around that, and this was NATO policy during the Cold War, is you launch a small number of nuclear weapons against the other side. And you make it clear you're now out on the slippery slope to oblivion. This is what Thomas Schelling called the manipulation of risk.
From a Western perspective, would it be wise to consider that China and Russia could form a natural alliance? Or should we consider Russia and China as a unified threat to Western security?
My experience going to Moscow before the Ukraine crisis blew up was that the Russians could not understand why the United States was picking a fight with Russia when it made eminently good sense for the United States and Russia to be allied. The Russian perspective was that historically, China and Russia had been mortal enemies on a number of occasions. When I was young, back in 1969, they fought a series of battles out in the Siberia area, and there are all sorts of potential disputes between the Chinese and the Russians. And Russians, in recent years have said to me, we are your natural allies. We are not a threat to take over Europe. And why aren't you forming an alliance? So I think if you talk about a natural alliance, in my opinion, the natural alliance was the United States and Russia against China. I will just point out to you that I had a number of Russian friends, very smart young Russian strategists, actually, who said to me, John, you think about U.S.-Russian relations in a binary fashion, which is wrong-headed. I used to talk about whether Russia should be allied with the United States or Russia should be allied with China. But their argument was, these were young Russian strategists, their argument was that the ideal strategy for Russia was to sit on the fence and not get involved either with the Chinese or with the United States. These young Russian strategists, very smart, said to me that this was the way that Russia should play its hand, not get too closely involved with the United States. And I had to admit that I hadn't even thought of that, and I think that they were right. But the end result is that we're not going there. We've now pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese.
You and together with other realists are very respected, but nevertheless a minority of the international relationship establishment, let's say. Do you see any chance that your view became dominant?
There is no question that realism is a deeply hated theory of international relations in the United States. It's very, very tough to be a realist in the United States. I've told a number of people here that when I go to China, that I feel like I am among my people. I've told some people that when I start my talks in China, I say, it's good to be among my people. Now, I want you to understand, I do not speak a word of Chinese. I feel like I am really in a foreign culture when I go to China. And it's one of the few times when I am conscious of the fact that I'm an American. Most of the time, I don't think of myself, in nationalistic terms. I don't think of myself as an American, right? Part of the West, that sort of thing. When I go to China, I feel very much like I am in a foreign culture. But intellectually, I'm at home in China, much more so than I am when I go to Washington, D.C., certainly when I'm on university campuses, because the Chinese are realists to the core. Right? This is true of the Russians as well. You go to Moscow, you talk to the Russians. Go to Iran. I was in Iran in 2018. These countries are filled at the top with people who are realists, and even in the universities. This is not true in the United States. Now, take this a step further. During the unipolar moment, remember what I said about the unipolar moment? There was only one great power by definition. And I said, you therefore cannot have great power politics. So it was really easy to dismiss realism during the unipolar moment. And the end result is that you got liberal hegemony. This is what my book is all about. The book is all about liberal hegemony during the unipolar moment. The problem is, from the liberal perspective, we're now in a multipolar world. Great power politics is alive and well. And there's no way the United States can avoid behaving like a realist great power. Realism is back. And I want to give you one example to highlight that. But before I do, you still never want to lose sight of the fact that even though the United States will act like a realist great power, it will put a velvet glove of liberalism over its realist fist to make it look like we're not really behaving in realist fashion. But we will. But here's the example I want to give. Joseph Biden was the vice president of the United States under Barack Obama. This was during the unipolar moment. And during the unipolar moment, we pursued a policy of engagement with China. I referenced this in my talk. We foolishly helped turn China into a great power. We foolishly helped turn China into a peer competitor. Every single administration, Republican and Democratic, from basically 1989 up until 2017, participated in that enterprise, Republicans and Democrats alike. Joseph Biden, as vice president, was a huge proponent of engagement, which is a thoroughly liberal policy, okay? Donald Trump comes into office. As I say in the book, Donald Trump explicitly ran against liberal hegemony. Furthermore, he moved into the White House when the world was turning multipolar, and therefore Trump approached China in a realist fashion. There's no question about that. He abandoned engagement. He explicitly abandoned engagement, this liberal policy, and he adopted a realist approach toward China. Then Trump is defeated in 2020, and who becomes president? Joe Biden. He has a track record. Engagement. The question you have to ask yourself is, when Biden becomes president, does Biden go back to engagement, liberal policy, or does he follow in the footsteps of Donald Trump and even toughen up our balance of power approach to dealing with China? The answer, as you surely know, is that Joe Biden does not go back to engagement, and one can easily argue that Joe Biden has been tougher on the Chinese than Donald Trump was. So Trump was clearly the guy who flipped the policy from engagement to realpolitik, but Joe Biden is following in his footsteps. But nevertheless, if you listen to the Americans talk about the competition between the United States and China, they don't describe it in balance of power terms. They don't describe it in the terms that you heard me describe it in here in my lecture. They describe it as an ideological fight between authoritarian regimes and liberal regimes, right? It goes back to that gentleman's question in the rear before about the East-West divide. We in the West, especially in the United States, define it in liberal terms. We have this very Manichean view of the conflict. They're the good guys, liberal Democrats. They're the bad guys, authoritarian states. And we're involved in this deep-seated ideological struggle. But I would argue that this is crazy. China was a communist state when we were playing kissy face with it, when we were involved in engagement. China's political system is not changed. What changed was the balance of power. Here was the basis of engagement, okay? When we were feeding the beast and China was getting more and more powerful, and I was saying, this is crazy, people would say engagement's going to work. And this is how engagement works. We integrate China into the world economy, and we make China rich. We make it prosperous, which of course we did. Number two, we integrate it into international institutions like the WTO, right, the IMF, the World Bank. We make it, this was Robert Zoellick's words. These were Robert Zoellick's words. We make it a responsible stakeholder. Think about those words, a responsible stakeholder. You make it a law-abiding or a rule-abiding state by integrating it into institutions, right? So it's prosperous, it's a rule-abiding state, and then what will happen is China will turn into a liberal democracy. Right? Because when you become prosperous, you become rich, and you're surrounded with all these other rich countries in these institutions. You democratize. And once China democratizes, we'll live happily ever after. That's the liberal theory of international politics known as democratic peace theory. My view, as you would expect, is, first of all, you can't be sure that they'll democratize. Second, even if they democratize, you can't be sure that they won't backslide. And third, even if they democratize and stay democratic, you can't know their intentions. And therefore, you do not want to take a chance. But you just couldn't make that argument, because getting back to your question, this gentleman in the front here, liberalism was such a powerful ideology during the unipolar moment. This, again, is the subject of my book. That those were really tough times for someone like me to get up before an audience like you and make a realist argument, because people thought the world had changed. You've all read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece. For those of you, the younger people in the crowd, if you haven't read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of History, which was published in 1989 in the National Interest, you should really read it, and read it carefully. It's an article, I think it's the most important article that has ever been written in the United States in terms of influencing foreign policy and influencing how the American foreign policy elite thinks. I believed at the time that it was a remarkably foolish argument, and that it would be proved wrong, and I do believe it has been proved wrong. But it's an argument that says we, the United States, played the principal role in defeating fascism in the first half of the 20th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we played the principal role defeating communism. And now the only viable political system that was left was liberal democracy. And in fact, what was going to happen with the passage of time was that the entire planet would end up being comprised of liberal democracies. Liberal democracy was the wave of the future. In a way, what Frank was saying in this famous piece is that the Americans have the wind at their back. History is on our side, even though he was talking about the end of history, right? We have the wind at our back. And Frank said that once the planet is populated with nothing but liberal democracies, there'll be no war, there'll be no conflict of any consequence. And he says explicitly in the piece that the biggest problem that we will face is boredom. Just think about that. And this line of argument is what underpinned engagement. The idea was that if you engage with China, right, the end result would be that China would become a liberal democracy, and again, we'd live happily ever after. NATO expansion. Most of you young people in the audience probably don't appreciate this, but NATO expansion up until 2014 was not aimed at containing Russia. It was designed to spread the liberal political order and economic order that had been established in Western Europe during the Cold War into Eastern Europe. This is why Vladimir Putin was invited to the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit. NATO expansion into Ukraine was not designed to contain Vladimir Putin. I told you, he was viewed as remarkably weak. Russia was viewed as remarkably weak, and we were trying to push NATO expansion down the Russians' throat, right? So what we were doing was, it was liberal hegemony. We wanted the Hungarians to join NATO and to join the EU, because you would then be joining institutions and you would become rule-abiding citizens. Furthermore, if you joined the EU, you got integrated into Western Europe, you become prosperous. And you did become prosperous. And furthermore, we wanted to make sure you became a liberal democracy. Many Hungarians, of course, complain bitterly about the fact that the Americans and the West, more generally, are trying to push liberalism on them. Yes, but that was part of the strategy, right? Liberal democracy in Hungary, prosperous Hungary, Hungary that's embedded in institutions. This is what we wanted to do with Ukraine. It's what we wanted to do with Poland, right? And the idea was, once we did that, we'd all live happily ever after. The real monkey wrench in the operation were the Russians, right? And we didn't think the Russians mattered that much. The Bush Doctrine in the Middle East. The Bush Doctrine was designed to turn the Middle East into a sea of democracies. When we invaded Iraq, we thought that Iraq was not the last stop on the train line. We thought we'd have to do Syria, maybe Iran, but eventually everybody would see how powerful we are, throw their hands up, surrender, and the Middle East would democratize. Frank Fukuyama told us that was going to happen. Fascism was dead, communism was dead, authoritarian governments, nah. We're talking about liberal democracy here, there, and everywhere. And this is the road that we went down. And it was a disaster, right? NATO expansion led to the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, as I laid it out here. The wars in the Middle East to foster democracy, they worked out really well. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Jeez, the amount of murder and mayhem that we helped create in the Middle East. And China, we created a peer competitor. Right? This was liberal hegemony. But the point I made is that that's in the rearview mirror now. Rhetorically, it's not, because that's the velvet glove. You want to remember, the Americans will continue to talk like liberals and act like realists, because we're playing hardball now, because we have two great power adversaries, and we're in a very dangerous situation.